Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. In January, the Trump administration issued an executive order halting funding for refugee resettlement agencies. In February, a Seattle judge blocked that action, but a legal battle remains, and thousands of refugee families are being left in limbo. Joining us now to discuss this issue is Krish O'Mara Vignarajah. She is the president and CEO of Global Refuge, a national refugee resettlement organization. Krish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Maggie.
So, I gave a kind of brief timeline of what's been happening for refugee resettlement agencies in the US, but from your perspective as CEO of Global Refuge, how have the last few months been? What exactly is going on?
Yeah, so every day has felt like triage. Part of it is just so much that has been impacted. So, first, the new administration suspended the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, which suspended a longstanding legal immigration pathway. And what we saw was that the impact was immediate. So, we're talking about Afghan allies who assisted U.S. troops during the war, Ukrainians displaced by Russia's invasion, Christians persecuted for their faith. Just to give you a few examples of the kinds of folks who were impacted. And for context, there were about 10,000 refugees who were approved over a years long extensive vetting process who had finally booked their tickets, but then their flights were immediately canceled because the program was suspended. And then just days later, the administration issued a stop work order, which essentially froze refugee resettlement services. For us, that meant that we had 6,000 newly arrived individuals, families who, could face extreme challenges like eviction, food insecurity as a result of some of these policy changes. And then, just for some context, it's just a real shame because the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program has really been the gold standard of bipartisan legal immigration pathways. We were really hopeful on day one when you heard from the Oval Office, kind of an affirmation for legal immigration that these would have, that these families would have been protected.
So, a lot has been halted by the federal government. What does that mean for your operations specifically? Have you had to pause your work, or do you have funding from other sources that allows you to help families resettle and find jobs and otherwise lead better lives?
Yeah, it's been a challenging time to lead Global Refuge because we are so strongly supported by the federal government. And that has been true under both Republican and Democratic administrations because we work with refugees, because we work with unaccompanied children. It means that the only way to serve those demographics is to partner with the Department of State and the Department of Health and Human Services. And that's what we've done for decades. So the last couple of months have been colored by making decisions on layoffs and furloughs. We are kind of the umbrella organization for local nonprofits all over the country. And for those tiny community based organizations, we've had to deal with massive layoffs. In one case, a nonprofit that just had to shutter as a result of some of the instability of the last several weeks.
Wow. So, not only is this affecting the refugee families that were planning on coming over, but you're seeing job losses, programs getting shut down on local levels.
Yeah, and it's hard, because these are kind of inflictions that have especially hit faith-based organizations. You've heard news not just about Global Refuge, but Catholic Charities. So many not of the nonprofits, the resettlement organizations are faith-based. Faith-based, actually, the majority of them are, and that's because so much of this work was done by congregations, churches, temples, synagogues, as the work began decades ago, and then ultimately became a federal program.
I hear you say local, and in this environment, I know part of the thesis for a lot of the cutting at the federal level is efficiency, and then there's some argument that some of these issues should not be American problems, and we could debate that in another segment. But what I'm wondering is, do you have global partners, folks in Europe or Middle East or Africa who are kind of picking up this work and can help, I don't know, supplement your work because of the difficulties and the complications happening in the US right now?
Yeah. Unfortunately, no, because we are talking about refugee families who are here in the United States already. Understandably, other nations aren't going to fund programs here in the U.S. by contrast to some of the programs that they would fund in the global South. The U.S. has actually always been a global humanitarian leader when it comes to refugee resettlement because of the nature of the program. When we talk about people coming the right way, this is really the gold standard. These are refugees who have gone to a refugee camp or they've crossed an international border. They are waiting in a third country to go through extreme vetting. And only when they've gone through those processes are they admitted to come to the U.S. Only 1% of refugees ever get resettled in their lifetime. And so when the U.S. has led on this program, other host nations in Europe, for example, Canada, have followed suit. And when we have stepped back, other countries have used this as an excuse. And so we're not just concerned about how the U.S. reacts, but how the global dynamics are impacted as well.
Now, you mentioned some of these families have gone through, or a lot of these families have gone through an extensive vetting process. They had their flight, and then this news hits, and then more news hits. What are you hearing from these families now? And where exactly are they? Have they made it to the US, or the ones who were kind of in process, are they stuck in that third country?
Yeah. So there's two different populations that we're talking about. For Global Refuge alone, we have 6,000 refugee individuals and families who are already here in the United States, meaning they are our neighbors. Their success is our success in terms of integrating them into our local communities. And then we have refugees who they may have sold all of their belongings. They may have given up temporary housing because we had promised to resettle them here in the United States. And for them, their flights got canceled. And so they are either stuck in a third country in a refugee camp. And it's incredibly difficult because for the clients that we serve, we hear from them every day. They are worried sick and for good reason. We have families who were days away from reuniting with loved ones who had already packed their bags. They'd said their goodbyes to be told that their flights to the U.S. had been canceled. We have families who have no idea how they're going to keep a roof over their head or get their children medical care. And I think that's the human toll that this is taking. I think to the credit of so many of our case managers, they're doing everything they can. We've looked to private resources to try to make up for the gap of what the federal government had promised and has now suspended. But how do you comfort someone when you don't have all those answers? That's the challenge that we're facing day to day.
How do you comfort someone when you don't have answers? It's a great question. Has the private donor community stepped up? Is there hope that they will step up more? You're speaking to a Forbes audience where a lot of entrepreneurs and philanthropists could be watching. What's your message to them?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think it's important to understand that when it comes to immigration, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Whether you think about how we keep Medicare and Social Security afloat, the fact that nearly half of Fortune 500 companies have been founded by an immigrant or their child. The range of jobs that are unfilled. We know that immigrants have played such a critical part and are essential to the economic engine of our country. And so we hope that people understand that this is really not just a part of our history of being a nation of immigrants, but part of our future. It has been amazing to see how individuals have seen the headlines of the last 2 months and asked the question of what they can do. And so, certainly, for those who want to support the work of Welcome, who understand how integral this is to our country's identity, we'd welcome people going to globalrefuge.org. You can learn more about how to get involved as a volunteer, maybe a donor, be a part of our advocacy efforts.
Now, I want to go back to something you said about the program for Afghan refugees. And I think there might be two populations within this because I've spoken to sources who are specifically concerned about Afghan girls who have gotten out of the country to receive education either here in the US on special visas and special programs or just across the world and across the Middle East. And then you have adults who might be out because of work that they did for the US government during the war. Let's start with that first group. Have you gotten involved on that, or can you give a status report of where we are on specifically Afghan female students who might be out of the country but not know what happens next?
Yeah, we are closely working with both the Afghan women, girls who came to the United States as part of the Afghan evacuation effort. We actually hosted a roundtable when Angelina Jolie had visited one of our offices as part of. Her role as an ambassador. And you just hear these stories of women who had served as journalists, activists, artists, who really were building a brighter future for their country. And then, obviously, as the U.S. military mission withdrawal impacted them and their safety, they sought haven here in the United States. We're working with them to rebuild their lives here. It's amazing the entrepreneurial spirit they bring. As you said, in terms of your audience, we actually, through New American Lending, which is a micro business and personal lending arm, it's a subsidiary of Global Refuge. We've been able to actually help a number of Afghan women who had businesses that got impacted by the Taliban restart them here in the United States. But as you said, there are still a number of Afghan women and girls who are stuck in third countries who we need to keep our promise to because they worked alongside us during America's longest war, advancing our mission. And we made a commitment to provide them protection. And I think it's important that we keep our word.
And for that second population, the gender agnostic population, because it wasn't just women helping the US government, men too. What should the public know about where they stand? And also, it strikes me as a potentially bipartisan issue, a humanitarian issue. I mean, all of this is, but especially for forces that helped us during one of our conflicts. Is there any hope of compromise or movement on that front?
There's certainly not as much movement as I'd like to see. When you think about the refugee applicants, we're talking about a universe of up to 200,000 Afghans who were told that they would be eligible for resettlement and who are now poised to languish abroad. And I think that's just such tragedy because, as you said, this is a program that has had bipartisan support. I think it's been amazing how national security champions have advocated alongside us. The reality is that the U.S., if we, God forbid, have to wage another 21st century war, we're going to need local assets. And people watch all across the globe when they see what the U.S. does in terms of our promise, whether we keep it or break it. And so I think that's where this isn't just a moral failure, it's a strategic one too. And I think my hope is that, if we can get out of the politics of some of these issues, we can realize that there is a bipartisan consensus and we need to figure out a pathway not to just provide a long-term legal protection for those who are here, but to also make sure that we complete our mission to those who are in third countries as well as in Afghanistan.
Krish, we've covered a lot of ground. This is an expansive issue. And I'm wondering, is there something that you're seeing on a day to day basis that we, the media, are not talking about or that the general public doesn't fully understand about what is happening with refugee resettlement right now in 2025?
I think there is obviously a lot of noise around immigration. When you turn on the headlines, sometimes you think that we are a nation divided. I travel to some of the reddest of red states and the bluest of blue states, and I actually see a consensus, which is we're a sovereign nation. We need to make sure that we can manage and secure our border, just as we strengthen legal pathways. And I think if we tell our politicians that this is not a political hot potato, that we actually need to reform what I think is clearly a broken system, our country will be better for it. And so I just hope folks out there, learn more about the issue, understand that this is not rocket science. We can fix the system. We don't have a policy problem. We have a political will issue. And that's where I think engaging the American public is going to be critical to our success going forward.
We don't have a policy problem, we have a political will issue. I think that's a good distillation of a lot of what is going on, and leads me to my final question. What are the next few weeks or months looking like for you? What is your work going to focus on? The legal limbo, we're in legal limbo, so what does that mean specifically for how you will operate?
Yeah, so my hope is that Congress will get more engaged. It's tough when you think about the fact that there was a Senate bill that had bipartisan support that was killed during the election season. Our hope is that there's enough courage on both sides of the aisle to come together and say, look, there are significant parts of our programs that we can reform. We'll be working day in and day out in terms of that advocacy effort, but it's also going to be figuring out how we restart these programs that are legal pathways. We're going to be in utter chaos if we essentially close every single pathway that exists into the country. And we're going to be paying a premium in terms of our pocketbooks if that's the case. And so we'll be trying to forge, reasonable compromise. It exists. I just think that there needs to be more focus on that. And then I think just, I'll be trying to work with my team, nonprofits all across the country to just make sure people understand the work that we do and why we do it. That, no one's profiteering off this, that nonprofits have always been the backbone of how we provide social services. I'm the daughter of two immigrants. I know that my daughter's lives will be easier because my parents' lives were hard. And to me, that's the American dream. I think so many of us can relate to that. And so I'll be fighting for us and what I think is such an American value.
Well, we'll have to have you back as you continue this work, but in the meantime, Krish, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time and your insight.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.